So this is just to introduce Professor Kerry Hood. So Kerry has a degree in and PhD in statistics and has worked in medical statistics since 1996. Spent the first part of her career focused on research in primary care, and then in 2006 established South East Wales Trials Unit, SU2 as I used to know it, and started to develop a broader research portfolio. Kerry's specific methodological research interests are in trial design, outcome measurement, and research inclusion, with a particular focus on complex trials, whilst the topic areas she mainly focuses on are primary care, infections, and learning disabilities. She's co-lead of the Trial Methodology Research Partnership Working Group for Trial Conduct. Professor Hood also collaborates widely across the UK and Europe on research studies from a broad range of funders, including NIHR, UKRI, EU, and industry. She has over 300 peer-reviewed research publications and currently holds £20 million of research grants. Kerry is a Fellow of the Royal Statistical Society and the Higher Education Academy and a member of the Society for Academic Primary Care. Professor Hood is keen to develop career pathways for researchers and is a mentor on the Society for Academic Primary Care Focus mentoring scheme, and also mentors undergraduate medical students. So that's in a nutshell, but I know that, Kerry, there's a lot more that could be put in that short bio. And I think it's useful to also flag that we have that Kerry is also a senior research leader for Health and Care Research Wales, and is a senior member of our faculty. And Kerry, you also sit on a number of different funding panels across the UK, and your experience from those, and particularly from sitting on the NIHR Health Technology Assessment Panel, is what is bringing you to talk to us today. And I think it's important to note that Kerry is not representing NIHR HTA specifically in this meeting, but really just leaning on her broad and in-depth experience.
Yes, brilliant. So the context for me being able to have the experience to talk specifically about the HTA panel and what we look for is that I've just completed 6 years of being on the HTA General Board, and I'll come back to exactly what the General Board looks at in a bit more detail in a moment. But so I've just completed that, and I have also sat on the overarching funding strategy group, which looks at the way all the boards operate for the HTA, and then also taken part in bespoke calls such as some of the COVID calls, and then there's been quite a lot of emphasis, for example, on things like there was a specific call out of process for looking at pulse oximeters and the way they work with different skin colours, for example, as a key priority for the NHS. So they pull on those panel members to do all of those other things as well. So I'm going to talk through a bit about what I think we look for in a HTA panel. I hope that it's useful for you all. Some of you I can see you joining are very experienced people applying for funding. Some of it will apply probably to most funding applications, but some of it is very HTA specific. So hopefully you won't feel like I'm teaching you to suck eggs if you've done lots of grant applications in the before in some elements, but you can also pick up the bits that are really very specific to an NIHR HTA panel. So if I start with talking about what the Health Technology Assessment Programme is and the panels that they run, so this is the largest of the NIHR project funding streams. So it has considerably more money than most of the others and tends to fund some very big major studies. So an average award from the Health Technology Assessment is usually well in excess of 1.5 million. So we're talking big grants here generally, and their focus is to fund research that's about the clinical and cost effectiveness and broader impact of healthcare treatments and tests. And they've recently had their remit extended to include social care, but it is probably fair to say that they're still finding their feet on social care. So in terms of the way they operate and all of those things. At pace, they know they need to do it, but prior to this, they've been very, very focused on things that were delivered in the NHS. And when we talk about health technology, we actually mean anything we do that is used to promote health, prevent and treat disease, improve rehabilitation or improve care. So it's not just drugs, And it's not just new and sexy interventions. It might be, I gave the example a moment ago of being asked to do a panel that was specifically looking at the way different pulse oximeters worked with colour of skin. Now, those are all different pulse oximeters are used in NHS organisations across the UK. So it was directly looking at the different ones that were in use and how they worked and whether they were contributed to driving inequalities. So that's an example of something. They will also sometimes be evaluating the withdrawal of something. So we've got quite a lot of areas where there's a lack of evidence base or and things that are done needlessly in the NHS, and so they will also consider within this the removal of something that and the impact of that if we think it's not being effective anymore. So that's essentially what a health technology assessment is about. This is a scheme that covers the whole of the UK. So whilst you may spot sometimes that some NIHR areas are not open to people outside England, this is very much a whole UK scheme. That said, you probably need to make sure that you've done a bit of thinking about how your questions and how you sell your study with a view to the fact that this is a UK-wide funding panel. So, that doesn't mean it's inappropriate to refer to Welsh priorities or Welsh policy documents in making your case, but you need to show an awareness of the rest of the UK as well in terms of defining the importance of your question. So I think they're unlikely to fund something that is only of interest to Wales now, but the vast majority of the stuff we do is of interest to patients across the UK. So that's not a challenge, but it is worth remembering in terms of the way in which you sell and make your case. So what types of funding call do they do? Well, I mentioned that I've been on the General Board. There are 3 funding panels for the HTA. One that focuses on researcher-led calls, one that focuses on commission calls, and then there is something called the General Board, which picks up all the overflow from those 2. So it's a very mixed board, and that General Board also looks at evidence syntheses and secondary research, so not just primary research. So the summarising of some of the differences within those. In researcher-led calls, you're selling the importance of your study. You're saying, I've got this problem, I've got a way to solve it, and I want to evaluate it and prove how effective it is. And that's essentially what you go to them with a researcher-led one. For commission calls, they can be very, very specific, such as we want these devices evaluated for how they work on skin colour, for example. And it's very, very clear they're going to fund one study to answer a specific question. They also, within the commissioning stream, have some that would be called a broad brief. So they might say, we're interested in interventions that might address condition X because we recognise that there's an urgent need for new treatments. And you would have a chance to define why you'd picked an intervention or a particular approach to looking at that. But again, there's some quite specific detailed documents which will tell you what they want and why they're after it. The other 2 things they have are a James Lind Alliance rolling call, which means if there is something on a priority setting partnership that's been published by the James Lind Alliance that you're answering that uncertainty, then you can put into that call to say, this is why it's important, this is what I'm doing. And then there's a similar rolling call for anything that's been defined as a research need by NICE. So those are kind of the range of different approaches you can take, and there's some nuanced differences I'll come on to in a moment. And then obviously primary research isn't just trials. So they do fund large observational studies, diagnostic accuracy studies, and under commissioned work, they may sometimes fund feasibility studies, but they don't tend to from researcher-led. They believe there's other places to go to for researcher-led feasibility work. So if you've got feasibility study you want to do, I wouldn't usually look at the HTA unless they've specifically said they want a feasibility study on something. And the reason they put out commission calls for feasibility studies is usually because they've been asked to commission a trial and there are too many uncertainties about whether that trial could be run. So they're often really, really quite tricky feasibility studies that they commission. And it's a way of them not investing too much money in trying to run a major trial when actually they're not sure it will run. And probably a good example from a local within Wales chief investigator would be Simon Noble did a commission call around the feasibility of randomising patients to stop or continue antithrombotics 6 months after treatment when they had ongoing cancer, and it was quite clear quite early that patients would not accept randomisation. So that answered that question, that it wasn't feasible to do, and some people within the HTA would say that's why they put out a commission call for feasibility, is because they don't think it can be done and they kind of want someone to prove that it can't be done. Secondary research I'm not going to talk as much about in a moment, but I think really a lot of it is generic for what we're saying. When I say evidence syntheses, they're not going to fund a bog standard straightforward, I just want to pull some data, to pull the literature together and create a narrative review. What they want to fund is things that will make a difference at the end of them, not something that will say more research is needed at the end. So they would usually be looking to fund their large scale evidence syntheses, probably individual patient data meta-analysis. So really what you're telling them is there's enough here, there's enough out there that we can actually draw conclusions on how we should treat people from it if it's brought together in a strong and robust way. And the modelling aspects, the economic modelling aspects of those secondary research ones are often very complex and cutting edge. All of the calls go through a stage 1 and a stage 2, and I'll come back to those in a minute. So essentially you put in a brief for application and then you go through a panel and then you're invited to stage 2 if they think that meets it. So there is a fast track process that you can go through if something's really urgent. I wouldn't necessarily use that unless you really felt you had to because of something that was happening in the services you want to evaluate. Stage 1 gives you vital feedback on the acceptabilities of some of the approaches you're taking. Before you have, stage 2s are a lot of work. So essentially it gives you a get out if there's some element of what you're doing that they won't like, and to get feedback of what might make it more acceptable. The other thing for a commission call is a focus commission call. They'll only fund one. So stage 1 is generally used to whittle down however many applications there are to probably no more than 2. So you could put in a very good commissioned stage 1, but it just not be in the top 2. And a reasonable number of commission calls only have 1 application or even none, but then you'll find some that have 10. So again, it's before you've done too much work on it, a stage 1 is a good thing to go through. So I've possibly started to indicate on this, but some of the specific differences between the calls in the way you approach an application. So the application form is the same for all of these. There'll be the same boxes, the same headings. There is a little bit difference in guidance, which is worth reading in detail, but it's what you put in those boxes that need to be different. For researcher-led, you are absolutely having to make the case for the need for your research. This has not come from somebody in policy saying this is important. You have to sell to them that this is a piece of work that is so needed by the NHS or social care that they need to invest probably a couple of £1 million in it. So that needs basis needs to be really strong. For a commission call, they've already, and theme and broad brief, they've already identified the need. That doesn't mean you don't need to kind of summarize it and feed it back, but really they've done that work for you. It will not go through an importance check in the same way when it comes to panel. However, they've done quite a lot of work on those areas to define what they want. So it's a good idea to give them what they want. If you think that you're stretching what you want to do to fit into their commissioned or broad brief, then I'd suggest that you go for a researcher-led. If you're trying to adapt something that was never intended to fit into those, just because there happens to be a call, it probably will be noticeable to the panel. So that's a discussion I have with people quite a lot when they want to respond to commissioned or broad brief calls. Coming on to the James Lind Alliance, I've said match the priorities that are set, but clearly match them. So I don't know how many of you have spent time looking at James Lind Alliance priorities. It is not uncommon for me to get applications where they'll say, this project addresses 7 of the top 10 priorities in condition X. And you just go, how? There's 7 uncertainties clearly identified and prioritised. You're not telling me how, you're not telling me clearly what and why. And that again would be unlikely to come through strongly. And then similarly, the NICE, you have to make it clear that it is matching what they recommended and what they have written in their report. So these may sound very basic, but it's very, very easy for people to get carried away with their studies that they have going around their heads and kind of forget the need sometimes to really, really match to those things. So one of the biggies that comes up in HTA, particularly for researcher-led, but it does come up in the others, is whether an intervention is ready for health technology assessment. So there is the NIHR and the MRC have established a framework of different funding panels, depending on the stage of development or the readiness of your intervention to practice. The HTA want to fund the piece of research that comes just before something then can be used in routine NHS care. So they don't want to fund the work that at the end of it you'll say, now we need to do another study. So in order to do that, there's an entire document on the HTA website, if you're not certain, to go through. And so they want a reasonable chance that it will already be effective. And there will be discussions in panel about whether there's enough of a signal that your intervention is going to be effective to justify a major trial. You would expect that it has already been tested in a typical NHS or social care setting, and that's probably not just in your personal clinic. Because interventions that have looked effective in passionate people who invented them's clinics don't often easily transfer into other settings in a very generalisable way. So, and there has to be a reasonable chance that it could be used across the NHS or social care if it's shown to be effective. So is there a way in which this could get moved into practice? Now, that might sound obvious. If it's a drug, then, well, it can get put onto a formulary, within reason in terms of cost effectiveness. But for example, we're seeing a huge growth in digital interventions, and that does mean that there needs to be some thought about how something that is a digital intervention you might have designed with a company or be in your own system, how actually would that be put into practice in the NHS in a way in which it was supported and maintained. So there's quite a bit to think about depending on what your intervention is. And as I've already indicated, evaluation could be that something's widely used, but there's actually a lack of evidence. So that could be withdrawal, or it can be heads between things. So what you're trying to define is kind of what should you start with in terms of treatments. And just as a final reminder in terms of language, all of this means we're talking about effectiveness, not efficacy. So I still sometimes see applications where people slip into efficacy language, and you need to be focusing on effectiveness language in terms of the way you're describing throughout your application. So these are just some examples of some of the sorts of things that they have funded very, very recently. This was just put to their website yesterday. So the first two of these are researcher-led. So we've got a rehab one, a support for family carers of dementia one, and then the bottom one there, which is about trauma-focused cognitive therapy in complex PTSD. That was a commissioned call that specifically said that there was a question needed for the NHS to answer that. And this is as much a nudge and a reminder that actually having a look on their website about what other things have been funded, the way they've been described, is a very, very good way to help shape what you're doing. I said some of this is now I'm going to move on to some general bits which might be slightly more generic for putting together a grant application, but I will pick up on the HTA aspects as we go through. Now, the applicant team needs to cover the disciplines and experience required. And that sounds obvious, but if you think back to that point I made about things being kind of ready to go into the NHS, that probably means making sure you've got the disciplines who might be delivering it in the NHS, even if they're not the ones delivering it in the study, to really understand that and think that through. It is not uncommon still to get applications that involve something that would end up probably being used in primary care, but being done entirely by secondary care teams. So that's a classic example. The other classic example is something that will actually end up being delivered by specialist nurses, opposed by teams that don't include specialist nurses. So make sure you've really thought about all those aspects and how they might contribute to the study. I've added them with enough time to support the study into it because the amount of time applicants put in is really important, and you are looking for credibility. Someone spending 1% of their time and being vital to the delivery of a study is not going to be relevant. So you don't just want it to be you and your mates, and I would estimate that the vast majority for primary studies you're probably talking about 10 to 15 co-applicants minimum. So it's almost a red flag if you see an application with only 3 or 4 co-aps. Actually, this isn't a properly thought through team for a major study. And then you need to be able to justify why people are there. Whilst I made that comment about big teams, there's also some aspects of, if everyone gets to be a co-op just because they happen to be a PI of a site that's going to recruit patients, that probably doesn't justify them as a co-op, and that's also started to being picked up more and more recently. One thing I've not put on here is that the HTA is actually very keen on co-CI models. So and part of that is because they recognise that that's how you develop the chief investigators of the future. So don't panic too much. So the chief investigator, the lead applicant, needs to be the right. You can justify them as the right person to lead the study. You can give them a senior experienced co-CI to support them. Some other funders, they might say, well, actually, put the senior person first, you're more likely to get the money. That's not the case here. You want to have the person who is most credible, but also has time. So if you put the bigwig who has 10 million other studies going on, they're probably going to look at it and go, that person doesn't have time to be the CI, but they might have time to support a CI. So just have a think about some of that. So the next point I want to make is that patient and public involvement is absolutely essential. It is not and robust patient and public involvement is essential. It needs to be recognised within your study team, usually with co-applicants, but that in and itself is not enough. Okay, so you need to describe how they've contributed to date, as well as the plans for throughout the duration of the study. You need to think about how it's influenced your proposal, and you need to justify it and appropriately resource it, and not just put it in one place. So if you're talking about outcomes in a section of your proposal, flag there how PPI might have informed that. Don't just kind of make it an add-on paragraph somewhere else. You can incorporate it in. One of the things there's been quite a lot of discussion on over the last few years, and I'm saying this because I don't think it's necessarily a right or a wrong, is more professional representatives coming on as co-ops. And I think it just needs a bit of thought who you're inviting to be a co-applicant. And if they're a professional representative of a patient support group, whether or not they actually have lived experience. And it's the lived experience that the panel really wants to see is incorporated into your proposal in some way, shape or form. That doesn't rule out the professional representatives, because often they can be a very useful group as well, but they don't replace the value of that lived experience. So do keep an eye on that. Feasibility is a biggie whenever we do it. You're probably aware that the vast majority of major projects run into challenges. Very few run to time and target at the moment, and therefore, in terms of appropriate use of public funds, the panel are looking at these sorts of questions. Can this actually be done in the timeframes they're talking about? And I would expect all HTA applications for primary research to have an internal pilot with key milestones and progression criteria, which would allow the funder to opt out at that point to say this isn't working and we're stopping and we're not spending the rest of the money. So that is an absolutely expected part of your application, to have an internal pilot. For a secondary synthesis study, now they're often a lot shorter, they're often only 12, 18 months. There still is often, particularly for the more expensive ones with complex modelling, an interim point at which you have to show that you've got enough data to justify the modelling. So particularly if you're trying to get individual patient data to do meta-analyses, those sorts of things, there's often a point. So it's not quite an internal pilot the same way as a prospective study. And some of the sorts of milestones might be recruitment, retention, ability to collect data, but they can also be more specific to your study, such as aspects around adherence to the intervention, for example. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about costings, but I did want to just mention that good value is about good value, that it's value for money to answer the questions. So Being good value for money means you've strongly made the case for the importance of the work. And then you've shown why all elements that you've put in are needed to truly answer that question. So that means you haven't loaded it with your lots of extra interesting mechanistic, I'm going to have this data so it will be interesting to know sort of thing, or if I get a bit of extra blood I can do something really novel and techie. HTA is not interested in that. But it's also not the same as cheap. Cutting your costs too much so it looks like you can't deliver will be picked up by the panel. Okay, and the one additional point I might make is that there is actually a reasonable amount of space in the justification for resources section. Actually, that's an opportunity for you to show you've really thought about the practical detail in the way you've put together the costings, not just say I've costed £600 for a computer and there's 3 people to do X. So that might be a bit of space you've got to use slightly more imaginatively to show that you've really thought about the practical details of delivering. How big should your study be? It should be just right. It shouldn't be too big and it shouldn't be too large. It should be just right, as Goldilocks would attest. So the key point here is that it's clearly justified, including assumptions, and that's all of the assumptions. Now, this is for whatever you're doing, whether it's a qualitative component within it or a quantitative bit. It's that you can clearly say where those assumptions have come from. Okay, that you link the design and the analysis, and it will answer the question to the degree to which it will give confidence that can change practice. Now, changing practice is often convincing a bunch of clinicians that they're going to do something differently. So quite often people will come in saying that they've done surveys and they've spoken to people to say, you know, if we showed this, it would change practice. So that's that you know, there's quite a lot of content sometimes underpinning that. That's not just the stats bit of a sample size calculation. Generally, they will accept single site feasibility studies in advance of this, but you'd have to really strongly sell it that you could ensure that that was generalizable. So usually some sort of work across a number of sites in advance to make sure things come through would be needed. So in terms of outcomes, they want to make sure that they're important to patients and clinicians. The biggest criticism I hear is people come in with very clinical or scientific primary outcomes because they're seen as very hard and objective, and patient outcomes are often patient reported, but that's often criticised for not being something that's really of relevance to patients. You do need to tie to core outcome sets and make sure that it really is. I know it sounds stupid for me to say this, but your outcome really does match your original hypothesis and why you solved the research question is so important, and that you're measuring it in a clear and validated way. We would also tend to look at whether you're overburdening people with too much data collection and how you're dealing with things like composite or co-primary outcomes. We're seeing more and more complex approaches than straightforward two-group comparisons in trials. And I'll come back to that under methodological innovation in a minute. So really some detailed thought about how you might justify some of these more complex outcome packages and how they'll be used to address your hypothesis. And that's particularly true if you're proposing a non-inferiority trial. So as the previous director of the HTA used to favour saying, well, I've got to know what's better. I know it's a non-inferiority study, but there's no point in me spending loads of my budget on a non-inferiority study unless something is better, like cheaper, side effects, something. Yeah, it's got to make some difference because we want to make a difference. So those are just a few things to have a think about when you're looking at outcomes. Any of you who've been looking at the NIHR website and the UKR actually will have seen there's been a huge drive on diversity now, and in diversity and inclusion in studies. Now, this is not a tick box exercise. They take it very seriously and will expect to see something that is not generic, that is thought about for your study. Now, they've actually put together, there's a variety of frameworks available called the Include frameworks to help you to think through that. But generally, they're framed around, I've pulled out some boxes just because around the impaired capacity to consent framework. But generally, they're framed around 4 questions. And if you address those 4 questions in your application, I think it really does bring it up in terms of making sure you've properly considered that. So that's, who are my trial results going to apply to? Are they likely to respond to the intervention in different ways? Will my intervention make it harder for them to respond? And will my trial design make it harder for them to take part or remain in the trial? So those are some key questions. Now, each of the toolkits use those questions, but then have various worksheets to help you think through if you think there's more of an issue for your particular population. And you can see how I mentioned the pulse oximeters for people with different skin colour might particularly focus on the ethnicity framework, but there'll be others where it's more important, such as early dementia studies, where maybe the impaired capacity to consent one is really, really important to focus on. Methodological innovation. Now, historically, there's been a bit of a sense that a rhetoric around that the HTA didn't fund novel trial designs. As long as you just put in simple two-arm trials, everything was fine, and then nothing else to get funded. That's really not the case anymore. And over the last 5 years, there's been a big drive to bring in more novel approaches to design. It does still have to be justified by the study question, though. This is a needs-led funding scheme, but it does allow you to put in some, we're seeing lots of different sorts of designs funded now. However, if you're putting in something that's very novel, you still need to give confidence that in the design when it's unfamiliar to the panel. So the panel may not have someone who recognises that design on it. So there's quite a lot to think about in terms of making sure you've given that confidence, and that you maximise opportunities to help people to understand the operating characteristics of those new designs. And I've put in the suggestion, it's not uncommon now to get links to GitHub code that shows simulation reports that can also be placed there in terms of the operating characteristics of a particular trial. My only caution would be, I have had one where it's like 300 pages and I'm like, I'm not reading that as a reviewer. So, kind of make sure you've done the hard thinking to work out what someone needs to know is important. And then just the final point was just in doing that, making sure you've thought about the practical risks of a novel design as well as the scientific ones. So, if you're offering patients are going to be involved in 5 different randomizations, is that actually reasonable in terms of practically what they can consent to? You may also have seen that the HTA is really pushing for the inclusion of studies within a trial and studies within a project. So these you can ask for some extra funding for, and these are based on the principle that there's so many functions and processes, particularly in trials, but actually they still apply to quite a lot of the rest of what we do, that are legacy, and they weigh down. You can see the weighing down with paper of the bike in the picture. And so there's an initiative to try to, across a number of studies, repeat protocols for studies within a trial, which would mean that across studies we can then draw some evidence about what does and doesn't work. And there's just 3 examples I've put there that are currently being undertaken. Now, these you don't need to put much detail in, but you can get extra funding to do, and are considered quite positively by the HTA. And if you don't have to come up with your own one, there's a registry for all the different SWOT protocols that are already there, and you could just pick one out and say that's the one that you're going to do for your study. So the last thing I kind of wanted to say, well, it's not the last thing on this, I've got a couple more slides after this, is developing a research proposal is a project in its own right. So you're going to a funder to say, give me £2 million to evaluate X, and your first piece of evidence you put in front of them that you can be proper and businesslike, and that you know how to pull together a team and to do that, is actually the piece of paper that you put in front of them. So, having thought about all those things in the development of your proposal and having a clarity and coherence in your proposal reflects that. It doesn't look good if you've got a proposal with a brilliantly written needs section because you're clinical and you know all of that, but then you've got a completely generic health economics section that doesn't even kind of mention the condition you're looking at and doesn't refer to anything of relevance. So having these very generic bits which look like they've just been copied from something else and dropped in is really not good. You want to make sure that the same level of clarity and coherence goes throughout your proposal, and that also goes with use of acronyms and kind of jargon and all those sorts of things. So it is really your, that's your selling point, how you frame that, and things like, it sounds stupid, but proper layout and spelling and proofreading is an important aspect too. So I'm coming towards the end now because I want some time for questions. Behind the scenes, what happens, just because that's sometimes useful to know, there is some preliminary review before they I don't think it's panel anymore, it's preliminary review for remit check in the office, and so sometimes things will get bounced out and said, oh, there's just no way, that's not even worth putting to panel because this isn't the right fit, you've not sent it to the right place. Peer review is only external peer review is only gained for stage 2, and those peer reviews you'll get a chance to respond to. Within a panel, you'll normally have a couple of designated committee members who are designated to look in detail and to discuss and raise issues and present to the panel. And there will also be a PPI reviewer at that point. If it's a really big grant, there'll be more. So the more money, public money you're planning to spend, the more people will be asked to go through it in detail. And essentially, those people are really key, because after their presentation, there might be questions from other reviewers, but most of the rest of the panel may have only read this quite briefly. So at stage 1, you get a yes or a no, invite to stage 2, or you score it if it's a stage 2, and everything above a score of 3, average score of 3.5 across the whole panel, is considered potentially fundable. So those are kind of, that's just kind of the process that's happening behind the scenes. So I wanted to just quickly go through what I think makes a good stage 1, because they are slightly different. It is important, you don't have that much space to get the balance right. So you want to make sure you've got a good summary of all aspects of the study, but not give too much detail in one area at the risk of detail in another. So that is a kind of a final editorial point, which you as a lead investigator probably get to do, because everyone will give you shed loads of content, and actually your challenge is to get it down to something that's balanced but still clear on all the important bits. You have to focus on that important question, and you have to focus on the remit. I think I've already said that enough. The costs are only summary at that point, but you still need to give confidence that you've thought through what is practically needed to deliver. And really, even if you're going to include SWOTs, it doesn't matter if you only mention them briefly or don't put them in at all at stage 1. They're not going to be the deciding point as whether you get to stage 2. But as I've already mentioned, the PPI. So then it's when you come up to stage 2, you get to respond to reviewers. Now, a reviewer's response, you get a real chance to answer questions that some people completely new to your application. So it's a real opportunity. So treat it as an opportunity, not a heart sink, oh dear, I've got this. It is also an opportunity to indicate if anything new has emerged since the submission, because you're adding content that will go in front of the panel. So if you've been doing some feasibility work or other things, it gives you a chance to refer to that. Key is to not be too argumentative. You know, reviewers have in good faith reviewed your application. Even if they've got the wrong end of the stick, you need to clearly and reflectively respond. But then a couple of quick things is you don't disagree with everything people have said, but you also don't say yes to every suggested change. Reviewers like redesigning your study, and there's a degree to which you need confidence in what you've originally proposed. And just be careful about changing things that might actually change your fundamental research question, or add in something that you just can't afford unless you're being given an opportunity to increase the budget. So with all that in mind, what makes a good stage 2 when it comes to a panel? Again, balance is important. You've got a lot more space, but you still don't want to put too little detail on one aspect. And you know, I have seen the odd application where you go, well, I've got a 20-page detailed project description with 1 paragraph on statistical analysis for a trial. That doesn't feel quite right. Yeah, that's me as a statistician looking at it. And I think most of this is things that I've already mentioned. The key thing I would also add is it is incredibly strong to show that you have thought about risks and risk mitigation strategies at this point. So if you can find space to put in, these are the major risks to the study, this is what we're doing already to try and address them, and this is how we reflect them as we're going on, that really goes down very well with the panel. Also show how you've responded to feedback from stage 1. So stage 1 will have given you feedback, so that's important. And keep your responses both to that and the reviewer's comments reflective and thoughtful. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them, they just keep them reflective and thoughtful. So I'm nearly done. I said I haven't got enough time for questions. I see 6 years and I've got too much experience. So I just thought it was very easy, very quickly to tell you what the kind of range, and I haven't put numbers on this, but I've ranked these in order of the most frequent responses we give. So at stage 1, we very much see our job as a panel to save people the effort of a stage 2 if we really don't think they're going to be successful. So reject is the most common outcome for everybody at stage 1. Okay, that's a point to note, and that reject could be because we just don't think the question's important enough. It could be because we think there's a major problem with the study design, or it could be just there's an accumulation of so many things that we'd almost be kind of telling you to redesign it, and that wouldn't go through. Or we might invite to stage 2. Very, very occasionally, we get sold on the question, but aren't sold on the study design, and then we might invite people to resubmit a stage 1 occasionally, but that's far, far rarer. At stage 2, the most common outcomes are reject or fund subject to changes. I think the fund subject to changes is actually slightly higher than reject. I couldn't quite remember when I wrote this, so and it is very rare for us just to fund outright. So expect, even if you get an award, that there will be an ongoing discussion about some changes or points that have been raised by the panel. The idea there is we want to get this to be the best study possible, and that answers the questions for the NHS, and that's the spirit in which that comes through. So I'm going to stop there